basement was damp and dimly lit. Luca led me from the stairs and toward a closed door on the other side of the unfinished basement. I could hear the muffled sounds of a man grunting. My palms were sweaty, my stomach in knots. I felt like I had to pee even though I just emptied my bladder upstairs. Luca stopped at the door, turning to look at me with hard brown eyes set deep in his fleshy face. He wore his dark hair slicked back on his head, held in place by some kind of gel. His black designer sweatsuit was covered with the white dog hair from his wife's little Pomeranian named Poochie. I was hyper-aware of all these details, and it was making me sick. I didn't like the world like this, so sharp and crisp. But I guess that's what fear does to you.
"You good, kid?"
Luca asked.
"Fine,"
I said, trying not to let what was happening inside show. Luca smirked knowingly, then turned and opened the door. Zane Caruso, cousin to crime boss Emilio Sagredo, was bound to a chair in the middle of the soundproofed room. He looked up at me with stony blue eyes and said something I couldn't understand against the duct tape over his mouth. He'd taken a beating, both his eyebrows split open and bleeding. His nose was broken, streaks of red running down from his nostrils over the duct tape and down his chin. Frank and Arturo were already in the room. They looked up at us as Luca ushered me inside. Frank looked unruffled in his dark suit, but Arturo was dressed in a white undershirt and jeans. He had sweat beading on his forehead under his jet black widow's peak. He had a leather sap in one hand. I stepped inside the room, my unease growing. Luca shut the door behind me. There was no turning back now. I was about to cross a line. The line. Frank and Arturo studied me as I stared at the bound man.
"Where's your brother?"
Frank asked.
"I'm doing it,"
I said, eyes fixed on Zane.
"I sent for your brother,"
Frank said.
"It's about time he got his hands dirty."
I don't know what to tell you, I said, finally looking Frank in the eye.
"I'm doing it. End of discussion. Whatever my brother was to you, he's out. I'm taking his place." "Look at the brass balls on Revo,"
Frank said.
"So it's true, eh? Your brother had some kind of mental breakdown?"
"He'll be fine," I said. "He just needs to be out of this life. Or at least this part of this life. You get that, don't you?" I was pushing things here. Everyone knew that Frank's son had tried to kill himself about a year ago. Frank had made all the arrangements to get his son out of the life, but he never talked about it, and bringing it up directly would have pissed him off something awful. Still, he got my point.
"Yeah, all right, Revo,"
he said.
"So you're taking his place. Get to work."
I nodded, throat thickening and stomach flipping. Don't throw up, I thought. Don't you dare throw up.
"Who's got it?"
I asked. Arturo pulled a small .22 pistol out of his back waistband and stepped over, handing it to me butt first.
"You sure you want to do this, kid?"
Luca asked.
"You know this will put you right up in the middle of the war, don't you?"
I know, I said. I was well aware of who this man was and what the Sagredo crime family would do in retaliation. But I didn't have much of a choice.
"He shouldn't have put his hands on her,"
I said.
"He brought this on himself."
Arturo and Frank shared a look. Then all three men stepped away from Zane, who was still talking shit against the tape over his mouth. I clicked the safety off and leveled the pistol at his head, right above the eyes. He peered up at me. I didn't see any fear there, only anger and hate. I pulled the trigger, and with that, I set in motion a series of events I could never have seen coming in my worst nightmare.
"Where the hell am I going?"
Lucas shouted from the driver's seat as he took a corner too fast, the back tires slipping on the wet asphalt before gaining traction again. Drivers behind us honked.
"I don't know. I think he said 21st Avenue.
I said, talking loudly over the sound of the roaring engine. The rain had stopped only minutes ago now, but everything was still wet. And if Luca wasn't careful, he was going to get us in an accident.
"Call him again,"
Luca said.
"That's what I'm doing."
There was no answer when I called Arturo's phone. We were coming up on 21st Avenue.
"Right or left?"
Luca said.
"I don't know,"
I said.
"Something happened to him before he could tell me. You know the man better than I do. What would he be doing on 21st? Got it,
Luca said, switching lanes and cutting a truck off to get in the left turn lane.
He goes to a massage parlor over here. That must be it.
We took the left fast, nearly getting T-boned by a minivan as we went.
Christ!
I said.
You're gonna get us killed before we can even get there. Just get your piece ready. He said someone was following him, right? Yeah, that's what he said, but what?
Luca asked, swerving around cars.
But what he said didn't make sense. He said the guy had red eyes.
Luca screwed his face up in confusion.
Red eyes? What the hell?
I pulled my pistol out of the glove compartment and held it in my right hand while I tried calling Arturo again with my left.
Look at this,
Luca said. Up ahead, on the right side of the road, was a small group of people standing around an alley mouth, peering down the alley. We came to a screeching stop right next to the alley. Several of the people jumped at the sound, turning to look at us just as I was getting out of the car, gun in hand. An old couple saw the gun and started off down the street in a hurry.
What happened?
I asked, noticing a woman in her bra and panties standing there, looking scared half to death.
Some guy went down that alley like he was being dragged,
a teenage boy said without looking at me.
Dragged by who?
I asked, as Luca joined me on the sidewalk, his gun out.
I don't know,
the kid said.
I didn't see nobody.
He turned to look at me, straightening when he saw the gun.
You a cop?
I ignored him, turning to the woman.
You the masseuse?
I asked. She looked at me, hands clasped at her chest, and nodded.
What happened? He just started screaming,
she said.
Screaming about a guy with red eyes. He grabbed his pants and ran out when he was still in his towel. You didn't see anyone?
Luca asked. She shook her head.
No one. I think he went crazy.
Luca and I looked at each other and then at the alley. It was crowded with dumpsters and soggy boxes and other debris. Without a word, we started down, guns held up. About halfway down, we saw a white towel on the ground behind a grease dumpster for some Chinese restaurant. We kept going, seeing a pair of slacks on the ground with a phone nearby. As we moved toward the other end of the alley, we kept expecting to come upon Arturo's body, but we never did. We stepped out the other side and looked around. Nothing. No sign of him.
You think they took him?
I asked.
It's the only thing that makes sense,
Luca said. We stood for a moment before turning and hustling back down the alley. I grabbed Arturo's phone and pants, and then we got into the car and sped off. We drove in silence, but as we pulled up to the boss's place, I said,
You think we'll ever see him again? Not alive,
Luca said. He paused before muttering,
Those motherfuckers, they're going down.
Outside the car, one of Frank's guards came out of the guardhouse and looked in at us. Then he stepped back in and radioed up to the house to let us in. The gate rolled open. As we rolled up to the house, I said,
What about that other thing? It's in my car, ready to go. We gotta deal with this right now,
Luca said.
But soon. We'll get that motherfucker soon.
As we were parking in front of Frank's 3-story mansion, we heard a shout from inside. We jumped out of the vehicle, guns in hand. We were running up the stairs toward the house when the front door opened, and Frank came running out. He saw us and pointed behind him.
Shoot him,
he said.
Shoot him!
We waited for someone to come out the door after him, but we saw no one. Frank glanced over his shoulder as he rushed down the stairs. Turning back, he shouted,
What the fuck are you waiting for? Shoot him! There's nobody there!
Luca yelled.
No one's coming after you, boss!
Frank came up to me and yanked the pistol out of my hand, then turned and fired it at nothing. I expected to see the bullets gouge holes in the stone steps, but that didn't happen. Like my pistol was loaded with blanks or something, which I knew wasn't the case. Frank fired my weapon empty, then screamed and ran out to the parking area. Luca and I watched in stunned disbelief. When Frank reached his Range Rover, he tossed my gun down and plunged both hands into his pockets. When he realized he didn't have his keys, he looked up at Luca and me.
Help me!
He screamed. Then, out of nowhere, Frank was knocked off his feet. Like an invisible fist decked him in the face. He hit the ground hard a moment before he started sliding backward, dragged by some invisible force around the back of the Range Rover. Luca and I ran down and looked behind the car, but Frank was gone. Just gone. Like he disappeared into thin air.
Mother Mary,
Lucas said, shaking his head.
it's not possible.
He ran to his car and jumped inside, peeling out on his way down the driveway. I just stood there next to the Range Rover, unable to process what was happening. I'd just seen the impossible, and my mind was scrambling to put the pieces together. After a minute, I got myself under control enough to pick up my pistol and get into my car and head out. I glanced at the box in the passenger seat, wondering what I should do with the thing inside. The guard stopped me as I reached the gate.
What the hell happened?
He asked.
Luca nearly ran over me on his way out.
I don't know, I said. Something's after us. Something bad. I'd go home and kiss your kids if I were you. I drove off, leaving the confused guard looking after me as I went. 5 minutes later, while I was waiting for a red light to change, I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw a hulking figure in a dark trench coat standing behind my car. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, like the kind guys in the 30s and 40s wore, and the brim seemed to darken his face. I couldn't see any facial features clearly except for his eyes, which glowed red like molten metal. I hit the gas, speeding into the intersection without even looking out the windshield. My eyes were fixed on the figure receding in my rearview mirror. 2 cars slammed on their brakes as I went through the intersection. When I reached the other side, I finally put my eyes on the road, and I knew where I had to go. It took me nearly an hour to get to Victor Segretto's house on the other side of town. I didn't see the figure with the red eyes during the trip. Even when I pulled over to deal with the thing in the box, I didn't see it. Still, I knew that it wouldn't be long before it caught up to me. When I pulled up to the gate in front of the Segretto's house, I was holding my pistol up, gripping the butt between thumb and finger like it was a dead fish. Still, the guard pointed a huge shotgun at me.
What do you want?
He asked. I want to talk to him, I said. No tricks, no weapons, just talk. The guy pulled out his phone and called up to the house. After a minute, he took my gun and let me through the gate. It was eerie how similar Victor Segretto's house was to Frank's. Like they'd both been designed by the same architect. At the bottom of the stairs, where other cars were parked, 2 men with semi-auto rifles stood, waiting for me. One of them frisked me before they escorted me up the stairs and into the lavish house. They showed me to an office on the 2nd floor. Victor Segretto had an indoor golf simulator with a big screen that showed a digital field. As I came in, he took a swing at an actual golf ball, which hit the screen and fell down while a digital golf ball soared through the air toward the green. He was a slender man with a black mustache and a horseshoe of black hair around his gleaming head. Turning to me, he smiled.
Rivo Genetti,
he said.
What brings you here? Have you come to make amends for killing my cousin?
What do you want? I asked. He stepped over, swinging his golf club.
Didn't I just say?
He asked.
Do you listen when your elders talk?
You'll call it off if I make amends? I asked. You'll call the thing off? He shrugged.
Sure, I'll call it off.
Okay, I said. So how do I make amends? Victor looked past me at the 2 guards with guns who were still standing in the room. Then he gestured for me to follow him. We walked over to his massive desk, where he picked up a fancy gold pen. I could see his lush backyard out the large windows behind the desk. He propped his golf club against the desk and then turned to me, proffering the pen.
If you take this and gouge your right eye out, we'll call it even,
he said. I stared at him, feeling the blood drain from my face.
Or would you rather die?
He asked. No, I managed, reaching out for the pen. I held it in my hand, imagining what it would feel like to jam it into my right eye.
Better hurry,
Victor said. I looked up at him, and he gestured behind me with his chin. I looked over my shoulder and saw the huge figure with the glowing eyes staring at me from the doorway, flanked by the 2 guards with guns.
You can see him?
I asked.
Of course,
Victor said.
He works for me, after all.
Swallowing, I turned back around and contemplated the pen. I twisted it, making the point come out. I gripped the pen tighter and looked up at Victor. He nodded encouragingly. I waited, thinking about the timer I'd set. I had been counting down in my head ever since flipping the switch on the device from the box as I drove up from the gate. Any time now.
You're running out of time,
Victor said. You got that right, I thought. The explosion shook the house. Even though the car bomb we'd built for Victor Segredo wasn't nearly big enough to do much damage to the structure, not from that far away, but it bought me a second of shock and surprise, a second I used exactly as I'd planned. I lunged for Segredo, jamming the pen into his left eye as hard and as far as I could. We went down, crashing into his desk and then onto the carpet, where I pulled the pen out and stabbed it into his throat. Feeling a presence behind me, I glanced over my shoulder and saw the figure leaning over me, eyes burning fiercely as it reached down. I dodged away from it, scrambling behind the desk just as the two guards opened fire. The windows behind the desk broke as bullets punched through the glass. Luckily, the desk was big and heavy and solid. It protected me. I crouched there and waited until the guards stopped firing to reload. I knew they would flank me, so I had to do this right. I threw myself at the half-broken window and fell to the first floor, landing in a bush below before rolling out and running along the house to the back of the property. By some miracle, I made it over the wall and disappeared into the streets beyond. I ran and ran, looking over my shoulder every few steps, and I've been running ever since. I don't know if the figure with the red eyes died with Segredo. I think it did, but that doesn't keep me from waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, expecting to see the thing standing over me. So far, I've managed to stay one step ahead of death, but it's coming for me sooner or later. Try as we might, no one lives forever. SCP-7853 is an anomalous method of execution employed by the Segredo crime family to assassinate individuals that threaten their activities. Physical evidence of SCP-7853 has yet to be discovered, but known victims have corroborated a universal description of the anomaly: a hulking, humanoid figure clothed in a trench coat, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Its facial features are heavily obscured by shadow, save for the presence of red, luminescent eyes. This entity is invisible to all but the individual targeted by SCP-7853. Victims describe the entity as perpetually moving towards them at a steady pace. Attempts to impede or slow the entity's advance are futile, as victims describe the figure phasing through any obstacles placed in its way. Attempts to physically damage SCP-7853 invariably fail, potentially due to its incorporeality. Completion of an SCP-7853 event results in the targeted individual suddenly disappearing, leaving no physical trace of their body, presumably killing them. It is assumed that this occurs when the SCP-7853 entity reaches the victim. But due to the nature of the anomaly, little verifiable evidence exists to confirm this. Hey guys, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more SCP stories like this one. You can also check out some more episodes from the SCP Experience podcast here. I'll see you in the next one.